The following podcast is brought to you by the Arthur Miller Society. Please visit us at arthurmillersociety.net for more information.
That is a $1 million idea.
Women are often sold a different story, which is that if you make people love you, and especially if you make men love you, then you get to be happy. And that was certainly what they were being sold in Miller's era, is, whether it's as a wife or as a mistress, whether it's as a perfect mother or as a sexy woman, if you make men love you, that's a women's version of being quote unquote well-liked.
Hi, welcome to the Arthur Miller Society podcast. From Dublin, Ireland, my name's Kieran Leinster.
And from Jaipur, India, I'm Ambika Singh.
Ambika, Happy New Year to you. How have you been?
Hey, Happy New Year, Kieran. I've been great. It was a nice little New Year break that I took with my family, and everything has been going pretty well. But COVID is back, and that's the only sad news because it's peaking all over the world. And in India, there are like record numbers every day right now. How are things in Dublin, by the way?
Yeah, we're pretty much the same. I mean, my own holiday break was a bit more COVID-ridden than I'd hoped for, but I'm feeling okay now, and I'm really excited for our first show of the year today.
Yes, today we have an excellent interview with the playwright Eleanor Burgess, whose new play, Wife of a Salesman, inspired obviously by the work of Arthur Miller, is premiering at the Writers' Theatre in Chicago in March. In today's episode, we discuss Eleanor's inspiration for the play, her relationship to Miller's work, and how, in her words, people get nice. Tickets are on sale now, and you can buy them and get more information at writerstheatre.org or simply Google Writers' Theatre Chicago.
Eleanor Burgess's work has been produced across the United States and also internationally. Originally from Brookline, Massachusetts, she studied history at Yale and dramatic writing at NYU Tisch.
Eleanor's 2019 play, The Niceties, has been produced at theatres across the US, including Manhattan Theatre Club, Geffen Playhouse, McCarter Theatre Centre, Huntington Theatre Company, as well as at the Finborough Theatre in London.
Her other plays, including Sparks Fly Upward, Start Down, Chill, and Galilee 34, have been produced or developed at Playwrights Horizons, The New Group, Ensemble Studio Theatre, the Alliance Theatre, Primary Stages, New York Theatre Workshop, and Page 73. Eleanor has also written for film and television, including Perry Mason on HBO and We Crashed on Apple TV.
We should say there were some connection issues which will be obvious to you in certain places, but that's going to happen when you have three people in three different locations of the world. We began by asking Eleanor how she's managed throughout the pandemic so far and whether she's had much experience of online performances.
I think I've been reasonably fortunate as theater workers go during the pandemic. I mean, partly, at least for writers, you can write. And to some degree, writers have always been living the way the rest of the world has had to start living. We've always just been really lonely people who sit in front of our computers all day. So when the rest of the world switched to work from home, I was like, welcome to my existence. And I had a play that went to a lot of places right before the pandemic. So I think I was lucky. I didn't have a ton of performances canceled. But so I also didn't do as much virtual theater as other people did. And I've enjoyed watching a lot of it, but haven't made a ton of it. And so that just timing wise, I sort of missed some of that experience. But even enjoying watching it, I've loved, since theater has reopened in New York, getting to go back in person. It just means the world to me. So I'm kind of team in person for theater. Hot take.
Yeah,
Sure.
yeah. From a teaching perspective, absolutely. And but I do have to get back to the theatre soon. So we're obviously here to talk about your upcoming play at the Writers' Theatre in Chicago, Wife of a Salesman. But one of the really interesting things about you is that you were a history teacher in another life. Can you talk about how you made the transition to a full-time writer and then how this experience has influenced your writing?
Yeah, definitely. I was a high school history teacher for a number of years before I decided to make the leap. And, I now see so many elements in common between those two interests. I now sort of looking back, see, first of all, that I was always very interested in narrative. History is a story of human beings and why they do what they do, and we construct narrative out of noise, in whether you're a historian or whether you're a playwright. I think that I've also always been really interested in sort of the dialectic between individuals and the world that they live in. The way that the year we were born shapes so much about our life and our personalities and our beliefs and who we are in ways that I think we don't talk about. As we talk about nature and we talk about nurture, and we don't talk about era. So I've always been very interested in how the world shapes people, and then people in turn shape the world. And I think that that's a theme that's really carried forward into my plays. But of course, it's like a very different day-to-day activity, and it was kind of a big change. I was very fortunate. I went to grad school at NYU when I sort of realized that if I didn't give writing a shot, I would regret it. And so I left teaching, which I missed very much, and decided to go to graduate school and really focus on playwriting and focus on kind of learning that craft.
Perhaps it was more of the discussions in the classroom that now shape a lot of what your thoughts, your subconscious, and that's how it comes out on the paper.
And I think of what we do in theater so much as like you gather to talk about hard things and to try to understand them together. And I think that's what a classroom is a gathering place to try to understand how human beings work and how history works and events work. And I think that's what we're doing in theater too, kind of like the gathering of the polis. To me, they're very similar activities in a lot of ways, even if the day-to-day existence looks very different.
By the way, what you just said about the individual and the society is a very Millerisque thought, I feel. The fish is in the water and the water is in the fish, right? Did you realize it?
I think the more that we'll talk more about that, but when I sort of started to undertake writing this play, I didn't know that much about Miller. And it was kind of very much like, I'm going to do this play because it's canonical, because I remember being annoyed by it when I was a teenager. And then I actually cracked open Miller and cracked open more of his work and his interviews and his thinking. And I was like, oh, we actually have very similar preoccupations. And I think some very similar convictions about, do people shape their own destiny and to what extent? And also I'm a very moralistic playwright, which used to be unfashionable in America, at least before Trump got elected. And then I've been lucky and suddenly it became fashionable again to be like, morals, they exist. And so I felt very connected to Miller in terms of he's such a moralist, and that really connected for me too. And I think that also comes from the teaching. It's you're doing it for a reason. It's not just art. It's it's for a social reason.
Yeah. So what first drew you to writing plays, and how does your theme or style for any play come about? What's your process like? And I'm seriously very interested in knowing what was that one point in your life where you decided that, no, I have to be a writer.
It was actually so gradual. My answer to the question is very gradual, and my connection with theater was sort of a gradual realization of kind of how I naturally think. I think what drew me to plays in particular, I've been able to piece it together a bit retroactively. I think I've always thought in terms of dialogue, even when I was a kid, I would often, when I was trying to work something through, imagine a conversation between me and a friend, even if the friend wasn't actually having the conversation with me, or imagine a conversation with my parents, or imagine a conversation with had a cast of imaginary friends through high school, and because I think to me, the truth often lies somewhere between strong perspectives that individuals have. One individual sees X and another individual sees Y, and the truth is almost always A, which is halfway between them. And I think of the truth as something that kind of hovers between people instead of something that one individual person can see or express. And so I think for me, dialogue has always seemed like a really natural way to get at the truth and to investigate a subject, because you stake out a strong position on one side and a strong position on another side, and you can sort of gradually see the truth forming between those, in the murky space between those positions. So I think I was always attracted to truth through dialogue. And I think that's a part of what, also made me a teacher. I think specifically, there's a very specific, when I grew up in Boston, Massachusetts, and I grew up seeing some theater. And I don't know whether it was like my parents' taste or the Massachusetts theater scene at the time, but like you saw a lot of like dead British playwrights. Like you saw a lot of like Shaw, and some living British playwrights like Stoppard, you was like Shakespeare, like maybe some Chekhov, like maybe some dead Russians, but like the idea that someone could do that for a job was extremely abstract to me. That didn't feel like a real thing. Like I wasn't a 60-year-old British man. So like, how would I be a playwright? And then when I was my first year out of college, I actually moved to London and taught there for a year. That was my first year of teaching. And God bless the subsidized National Theatre of the United Kingdom, which we do not have in America. I was able to, on a teacher's salary, go see like 3 plays a week. And I just loved it. And also then was seeing plays that were being written about things that were happening right then, that were so clearly being written by people my age or a little older than me about that moment. And the idea that this was a real job that people were doing. And where you could talk about, like, now you didn't have to talk about like Russia in 1900, you could talk about things that felt current. It suddenly became real to me. And I think once I realized that that was something real, I couldn't resist. And I started writing my first play. And I just never stopped writing after that.
Beautiful. And I think Euron and I would always be jealous of anybody who is able to go to the theater 3 times every week.
Best year of my life in some ways. Like, I haven't been able to since, but it was incredible.
Those subsidized theaters are just beautiful over there. And I love what you said as well about the truth through dialogue, because that comes across so strongly in The Niceties. It's those 2 different generations, 2 completely different people who are just kind of hammering each other for the play. I thought it was really, really honest. I really enjoyed it. But the main reason you're here with us today is that you've written, as we've mentioned, Wife of a Salesman, inspired obviously by Miller's play. And so can you talk to us a little bit about the play and then more specifically how it relates to Death of a Salesman?
Yeah, I mean, I think the glib description is that it's Death of a Salesman with all the men taken out. Like if you take out all the male characters from Death of a Salesman, you're not left with a lot of characters. So the play tells the story of a housewife in 1950s, from 1950s Brooklyn, or around 1950 Brooklyn, who drives up to Boston to confront her husband's mistress and to ask her to stop the affair. And so it sort of, structurally began as, okay, what if you write Death of a Salesman, but you take the men out? Because, I mean, there's this, obviously, the famous quotation from Death of a Salesman, attention must be paid. And what if we shift our lens and pay attention to the other people? And what if we pay attention to the mistress who is only called the woman in Miller's play? She doesn't have a name. And what if we pay attention to Linda, who is so insistent on paying attention to Willie? And what if we give them space to talk and to say how they're experiencing the world? And I think thematically, to me, especially, I think so much of what Death of a Salesman is about is the American dream, which I had never fully realized, because if you grow up in America, you just hear the American dream, you hear it constantly. And I had never fully processed how much of like a male dream it's supposed to be. Like you're supposed to go out into the world and like earn enough money that you earn respect, and then you buy a house. And like, I guess women, like including myself, are sort of like traditionally an accessory in someone else's American dream. Like they put me in the house that they earned, But Miller is so interested in examining this sort of lie that men are sold of like, well, if you just go out and earn enough money, you get to be happy and you get to feel good about yourself. And I started to be really curious about, well, what's the lie that women are sold? And is it the same lie? And it's not quite, even with things really changing in terms of, things have changed enormously in terms of how many women are in the workplace. I still think that women are often sold a different story, which is that if you make people love you, and especially if you make men love you, then you get to be happy. And that was certainly what they were being sold in Miller's era, is, whether it's as a wife or as a mistress, whether it's as a perfect mother or as a sexy woman, if you make men love you, that's a women's version of being quote unquote well liked, and women's version of, then you get to be okay and you get to feel okay about yourself. And in the exact same way that, like, it's a mirage for Willie that he falls for, I think a lot of women sort of fall for that and then devote their lives to it and discover that it may not necessarily, be that dream that they were promised, but like all of society depends on people falling for this illusion over and over again. So I was really interested in kind of examining, like, what is the American dream for women and for women in that era, and what is the archetypal female story of, we have all these great archetypal American male stories, and what is the archetypal American female story?
Makes perfect sense. I think it's ironical that in the first place, that American dream has to be all about money. And and if you have to live that dream, you have to, not sleep and just keep at the target and keep earning money, keep meeting the deadlines and just reaching that one stage. But to think in the direction of what it means for the women of that era, I think that's wonderful.
And I think also, sorry, but I totally agree. And I think was something that also interests me in the play, and that I hope the play touches on, is that, for me, it doesn't feel like liberation to be Linda and to be like, okay, well, great. Like, you earn happiness by making men love you. But like, Willie is clearly also not liberated. And so, like, what are women supposed to, if we're just swapping out, like, be a perfect wife for be a perfect worker, that's not great for American women either. And trying to kind of imagine what would liberation actually look like for men and for women, and, not being either a perfect tool of capitalism or a perfect tool of the patriarchy, but can we even imagine what that would look like? Because I think a lot of women in my generation or generation before have just swapped what Linda was told to do with, like, what Willie is told to do, like, go out and earn enough money and then you get to feel good about yourself. And you're like, oh, is that better? I don't know if that's better.
It's not.
It's not. I don't think it's better.
I can speak for myself here. Yes, it's not better.
Yeah, I don't want women to just have men's misery. That's not liberation.
Yeah. Kieran, your thoughts on this?
Misery either.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think it's a great point that being a worker drone. Now I'm wannabe academic, so I've got no idea what being a worker drone looks like, but it doesn't, or what being a worker drone is like, but it doesn't look like a whole lot of fun. So I wouldn't advise it, I don't think.
So you've already told us a little bit about the fact that you don't really appreciate certain works, but when did you start reading Miller, and what was your experience like in the first go, and what were the plays that got you hooked?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I read Death of a Salesman in high school when I was a junior in high school as part of, like, our American Lit curriculum, which is, on the one hand, wonderful. Like, I love when high school students have a chance to read plays, and at least with my education, you don't read that many of them. I think I read Death of a Salesman, Fences, and The Crucible was basically, and, like, a lot of Shakespeare. So on the one hand, like, I love it, and on the other hand, I was way too young to have any idea what he was actually talking about. So my recollection of Miller was, God, what an annoying play, because I found Willie Loman annoying. And I found him, like, mean. And I was like, why am I reading this play about this jerk? And, like, now I reread it and I'm like, well, Miller knew that. Like, Miller wasn't like Willy Loman, a perfect person, be like him, and maybe this was just my own problem in high school. I had this reaction to like a lot of great books where like I remember reading like Things Fall Apart and Native Son and being like, such annoying people, and I was like, Eleanor, you missed the point completely. But so I had this kind of idea in my head of not loving Miller. And I have other issues with The Crucible, but which we talked about before we started. But I think that then when I was actually in graduate school and when I was writing plays and sort of studying structure and character and able to kind of appreciate tragic structure, then all of a sudden I came back to Death of a Salesman and to All My Sons and to View from the Bridge, and sort of, it's like these are incredibly moving plays, and the amount of, I say it in the best possible way, pathos that he's able to generate and release, the amount of, pain he's able to put people through is so cathartic and so powerful. And so I started to appreciate him sort of as a writer and a dramatist. But I think it was really only after I decided to write this play that I fully appreciated how much Death of a Salesman was criticizing all the things that I felt critical of. I'd sort of thought it was upholding something that actually it was completely criticizing. I really misunderstood it as a teenager. So it was great to come back to it and realize the profundity there.
I was going to say this is kind of a general point I think about contemporary views of Miller, is that he's often kind of held up as, well, this is the guy who sort of defended, who defended some abstract entity of America throughout his life. But in reality, he was writing about corrupt military parts manufacturers, like just after the Second World War.
He was such a critic of the rah-rah American patriotism and rah-rah life. Yeah, it's so strange because he's seen as such a part of it. And I think similarly in like a theatrical standpoint, he's seen as like an upholder of well-made plays because he was so good at, the structural elements of play. And then he like did a lot of much more radical experiments with storytelling structure and design, and, was a much looser thinker and writer, and a much more rebellious thinker and writer than I think he's seen as being.
I definitely, that's something that myself and Ambika talk about all the time off mic. So it's great to hear somebody else saying it. But I was just curious about this. There's a brief on the Writers Theatre website. It says the play was also influenced by conversations with your grandmothers. And we'd love to know a bit more about this. And do any aspects of your grandmothers appear in these characters?
Yeah, well, a lot of it actually, unfortunately, I started writing a play after both my grandmothers had passed away, so it wasn't directly influenced by conversations with my grandmothers. But when I was first thinking of writing the play, when I'd sort of had this idea of, wait, I might write Death of a Salesman with the men taken out, I was actually on a little vacation with my mom and had this book with me. And one night she woke up really early and she read it that morning. And when I got up for breakfast, she said, wait, Eleanor, do you know this is the story of our family? And I had sort of theoretically known, but didn't know. Like my grandfather was a salesman in Brooklyn in the 1950s. That was his job. He was a salesman for Pitney Bowes, like office supply company. And he would like spend his days driving to places and pitching people. And my grandmother was at first being a housewife on Long Island, which really did not suit her, and then was able to kind of go back to work. And my other grandmother was in Boston at the time, and where, the woman lives. And she was not, to the best of my knowledge, a mistress of anyone, but was similarly, she actually became a full-time housewife and never worked again after working during World War II in a factory. And I think both of them had a lot of trouble with those roles. They were people for whom not being outside the home was not a good fit. And to some degree, they kind of died never fully talking about that. So I say it's shaped by conversations with my grandmothers. I mean, to some degree, it's shaped by conversations I wish I'd had with them, but people asked, I think that the question of what would you have wanted to be was so painful because it just happened too late. Like whatever you want to call it, feminist revolution was too late for them. And they never really got to imagine a bigger life for themselves. And so there's little details of the characters are sprinkled are really from my grandmother's. There's the Linda-ish housewife character has a couple of years of economics classes from Brooklyn College, which my grandmother had. The secretarial work is what my other grandmother did. And kind of the pride they took in those experiences are based on things that I heard them. My grandmother loved to talk about the classes she took at Brooklyn College. So I think that it's kind of me wanting to try to open up space I do think that there was this whole generation of women who never really told their stories. And the ones who did were by definition exceptional. Like the ones who did tell their stories were like Lillian Hellman told her story, Claire Booth Lewis told her story, but like by definition, they're the ones who are different, and the ones who didn't beat the times and didn't beat the odds. I think in my family's case, we're kind of silent about it till the day they died. And so I was trying to kind of open up a space for an imaginary conversation that I think they never either got to have or never chose to have about, could they have imagined what they would have wanted and how did they feel about the deal they made to become mothers and to live through their home and through their spouses and through their kids. So yeah, there's sort of imaginary conversations I wish I had more than real, but I had a lot of conversations with my mother and with my grandfather and my dad kind of about what do you remember about them and what do you think they would have said? And it's been really meaningful to get to explore the family history that way.
It makes me think I need to speak to my mom seriously because she is a kind of Linda-ish character and I think she doesn't complain much, but I think like for me personally, she constantly wanted that I have a career, that I go on and get the education that maybe she couldn't have, but she didn't say it as clearly. So maybe there's just too many grandmothers and mothers who don't, voice what they're really feeling or what they couldn't do, because it's more of a habit to live through others. It's more of a social conditioning.
One of the things that moves me so much, I've had a few, public readings of this play, and people at the end of it are like, I have to call my mom. And I'm like, that moves me so much. Like if people are like, I should go call my mother, like that's the most meaningful thing they could think after this play ends is like, I should go listen to, there's a lot of women that we have never listened to because they don't have the like sexy, dramatic, rebellious stories. And I think attention must be paid to the people who have the less dramatic stories as well. And I hope the play can kind of nudge people to think about and listen to them.
But invoking such a well-known play is a really bold, exciting move. Are you at all worried that people will compare it to Salesman or dismiss your interpretation of Miller and his work because it does not fit their narrative around Miller?
Definitely. There's, you guys know, there's a joke I've told about, I expect people to walk up to me and say, well, I have a PhD in Arthur Miller, and what you really don't understand about him is blah, 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 blah. And I don't have a PhD in Arthur Miller, and I actually haven't studied him that much besides, obsessively reading his play over and over. And I think part of it, I think anytime you write a play, you have to be prepared for people to want you to have written something different or to not be on board with what you have chosen to write. And I've tried to lean pretty clearly into the fact, in a lot of ways, this isn't about Miller. I mean, I think that's what's going to trip people up the most is like, it's not about him. It's not about Willy Loman. Like the whole point is let's move the camera lens, let's move our attention. To the point that the plot, if I'm waiting for someone to like call me on this, so I'm going to say it so that there's evidence that I absolutely knew this. The timelines don't line up at all because in my play, the confrontation between the wife and the mistress happens in 1950. And of course, in Death of a Salesman, the affair was in like around the nebulous 1920 to 1930 kind of time period. Like it's not the same people even really. Like partly I didn't know how to write Linda Lohman because like I don't relate to her, but like, and for legal reasons, like I don't have any rights to the character Linda Lohman, but also just to free myself. Like I'm not trying to write his characters and I'm not trying to, it doesn't slot into, there were versions of the early versions of the play where if you knew Death of a Salesman, there were more Easter eggs. There was like, oh, they're talking about Happy or they're talking about Charlie or Biff or, you know, and I ended up cutting all of those out because the whole point of this play is that we already have Death of a Salesman and we've all read it and we've all seen it and that's great and it's a masterpiece. And the whole point of this play is what haven't we talked about? What haven't we said? Who haven't we shed a light on? So I think that will be jarring for some people if they're waiting for me to be talking about Miller, to be talking about Willie, because I don't want to, you know, and I want to talk about, and a lot of the women's, once they start to open up to each other, you know, I describe it as a confrontation, but there's a lot of connection too. So much of what they have to say about their own lives isn't about Willie at all. It's about themselves and their needs and their expectations. And so I think that might be very jarring for people. You know, it's the like classic Bechdel test thing of, I think that like a lot of men imagine that when women get together, they talk about men and especially these two women where what they have in common is a man, but a lot of what they have to talk about is not necessarily him. But I hope that people go along for that ride. I think you're always, every time you put a play out there, you're hoping that people come to hear the play that you wrote and they can object to the one that you wrote or, you know, be along on that journey or not be along on that journey, but that they are willing to accept that like you wrote what you wrote and it's not every story. And someone else can write the like fabulous Easter egg, secret untold story of Happy and Biff. And like, that's great. And I didn't want to. So I hope people are up for that.
No, I think it's very cool. But I do, unfortunately, I do have more slightly Miller-focused questions to ask, but you can...
And that's totally not. I also absolutely recognize that when you have a title like Wife of a Salesman, you are asking for it and like you're gonna get it. Like I'm so absolutely okay with and on board with that too. Like I
okay.
kind of just dare people to ask me about Miller so that I can talk about how I'm not talking about him.
You were so right about people with PhDs on Miller.
Oh, yeah.
It's going to happen. We're like audience members who want to tell me about the production of Death of a Salesman that they saw and why they liked it. Like it's all going to happen. It's going to be good.
Oh yeah. It's far too easy to predict. So I want to ask then, and the answer can be an extremely swift no. But were there any other aspects of his life or work that fed into your own reading or writing of the play?
Definitely. And this is where I might be, you know, opening myself up for pitchforks. Because I also think that when you like criticize a brilliant writer, people think you're saying you're better than them. And like, I'm not. I have blind spots galore and I'm a person of my times too. But I do think that Miller, sort of looking at his wider canon of work, and it certainly happened in Death of a Salesman too, but it's in a lot of the plays. One thing that I was very interested in, he has this giant Madonna horror complex, like, you know, where people are either good mothers or they're Marilyn Monroe. And I get how, like, if you married like the most eternal sex symbol on the planet, that might really fuck you up. Sorry, I don't know if I'm allowed to swear.
Definitely you are. Yeah.
Right. I get that might affect you. But he clearly over and over again divided women into, mothers and sex symbols. And a big part of what is happening in this play, where like literally one character is called wife and one character is called mistress, is that if the American dream for women is make men love you, they have taken different approaches. And one has taken the approach of, I will be the good wife, and, I will be virtuous, and I will be loving, and I will be giving, and I'll be kind. And the other one has taken the approach of I will be sexy, and I will be exciting, and I will be attractive. And both of them have not been allowed to be a full person, because they're, in the same way that Willie has to flatten himself into like a jokester or a salesman, they've had to flatten themselves into wife and mistress. And I think that was partly really a response to a frustration with that. Like, what's so difficult with Miller is that he's such a humanist. He's such a profound humanist. He's such a profound moralist. And then the things that he's not insightful about, he's so uninsightful about. He has so much humanism for very specific people, and so much love and attention and depth to give to those very specific people, and then absolutely doesn't get the other people. And I think that sort of desire to step in and kind of break down, like, what is like sexiness? What is flirtation from the perspective of the person who's doing it, rather than from the perspective of the man who's been flirted with, the John Proctor, or I forget what his alter ego was called in After the Fall. Maybe he called it like Arthur. I can't even remember. So I think that was something that I was very interested in deconstructing. And that's one of the sort of more kind of negative things I was responding to. And I've mentioned all the positives of, the strong moral current in his writing and the strong social current. I don't want everyone to be like, she hates Miller and blah, blah, blah. Like, I don't. But that was something that I was like, you did it over and over again.
No, I think like those flaws they're evidently there in the writing, in the plays, like in his personal life. Even has an essay that is really bizarrely naive. I think it's called 1956 and all that, like written at the time, where he kind of suggests that what America should do is some sort of cultural international Peace Corps and send people across the world and promoting positive aspects of American culture. And it's like, what? Like, what are you talking about now? It's a really, really strange thing for him to have written. So yeah, like this is no space for like a Miller hagiography, really. Don't worry.
But the funny part is that I still meet, and I'm not, please don't take it as like a full on defense, but I still meet just too many men who divide women that way. So
yeah,
and Miller was born into a completely different era where things were, so the social conditioning overall was completely different. And I still meet in 2021 men who divide women like the Madonnas and the you know what. So
I became a mom 2.5 years ago, and actually, this play has been a very interesting. I wrote the first draft long before I was pregnant. I workshopped it when I was pregnant. I workshopped it again after I had a newborn. And then I wrote a very big rewrite when I had a toddler. And now I'm going into production with a toddler. And so in many ways, I've kind of made my own transition into motherhood and into American motherhood while working on the play. And that question of what it does to your identity. I mean, in a lot of ways, and this is so un-Miller, I think of it as a play about motherhood and women on two sides of that coin, on the pre-motherhood or non-motherhood and motherhood sides. And Miller seeing that as a Madonna whore divide, but I think for women, it's much more of a mother, non-mother divide, and that being a really different lens to look at that divide. And the way that it feels is very interesting, but very not the way that men seem to think that it feels. I think so. I found when I was pregnant that so little art out there was able to talk to me about what was coming, because almost none of it was written by mothers. Most of it was written by men. And then the stuff that was written by women was frequently written by women who, for various reasons, maybe to preserve their professional opportunities, maybe because it didn't suit them, didn't have kids. And there was so little art out there about what happens to your identity when you become a mom in positive and negative ways. And so for me, a lot of what this play has ended up being is kind of an attempt to write what wasn't there for me that I needed. And that's sort of where it gets radically un-Miller. And like, I'm not talking about Death of a Salesman, I'm talking about what it feels like to be the person who like built a life, and it's totally not capitalism. It's the radical opposite of capitalism because you do an immense amount of work for free. And that's ended up being a huge theme. It's less of like a rebuke to men and more of but here's this other thing.
Yep. The confrontation between the two women in the play, the wife and the mistress, throws light on themes of marriage, partnership, and the relationships between men and women and women and women. How do you expect audiences to react to these relationships?
Oh gosh, so interesting. And I have no idea. And I think it will depend a lot on who's in the audience. And I'm curious. I'm excited. I think that there's something so personal, but it's not a play about cheating, but it is a play about cheating. Like, how it moves pretty quickly past the why do people cheat and that kind of stuff. But at the same time, I think that's a huge live wire for a lot of people in their lives. I think that question of how much things have changed, I think is a huge thing that I want audiences to be reacting to, and women being in a fight with each other, that, well, you're either the Madonna or the whore and you have to be right. And the other person is wrong kind of aspect to the way that the two women think, which I think is pretty like period accurate. But, how much has it changed? How much has it not changed? I'm curious about how audiences respond to that. Like whether they're like, oh, this is why do they have to approach each other this way versus still kind of siding with one woman over another? I think that there's a lot of, questions of who does what within a marriage and whose responsibility. There's a lot of, what does the husband do versus what does the wife do, and what frustrates them about each other. And I'm really curious about how much of it is like unchanged since 1950, and how much like there's something so eternal when you start to get into gender dynamics where you can like read a joke from, a Shakespeare play about men and women, and you're like, that is still accurate joke, but I also hope that a lot of it has changed. So I think that that's something that I'm really excited to see an audience. Like, when do people, turn and glare at their partner during the show, and when do they laugh because their lives have gotten better and they're relieved?
Yeah, I'd love to know that exact point where they're kind of realizing that the other one does something that someone on stage does and they don't like it. This kind of follows on from our last question, and if you already answered it, you can feel free to skip it. But do you think there's something in particular we can kind of learn about contemporary life by evoking salesmen like this?
Well, and I think something that we alluded to actually earlier, I maybe like let it out of the box too early in the conversation, but to me that question of what's so brilliant about Miller, it's so easy to get frustrated with Miller with, the gender roles he confines women to, and the lack of attention and liberation for some of his female characters. But what he so brilliantly depicts is that it's not like, I think so often we then are like, well, get rid of the patriarchy, like let women do what men do, and then, everything's better. And what Miller so brilliantly pointed out was that if you're just going from being, an unpaid housewife drudge to being like a cog in a capitalist system, like that's not awesome. That's not like, yay for women. Like now, instead of seeking the approval of, our husbands, we seek the approval of our bosses. Like that's not necessarily better, So I think that wanting to examine like, okay, well, if we don't want to be Linda, but we also don't want to be Willie, what do we want to be? Because I think so often a lot of, I mean, for lack of a better term, like feminist art is like, well, here's why you don't want to be Linda. But you also have to have the other half of that conversation, which is like, is it better if you're defining yourself by your career? Is it better if you're defining yourself by how much money you make and how much power you can accrue in this system that is so cruel to people who don't accrue power? You know, like so many of our like feminist art pieces, especially in like film and TV, are like, women can be murderers too, and like women can be ruthless, bloodthirsty dictators too. And you're like, is this feminism? You know, so I think that kind of trying to open that question up is something that I really hope this play does. I'm like, well, what is, and like, you know, as someone who I have found motherhood very meaningful, I find my career very meaningful. Like, can we blend this in a way that is positive for both men and women, is something that I really hope the play can start some conversations about.
I think most of us would not like to be Linda, but you know, we would not like to be Willie, but we would not like to be exploited like Linda either. So it's that kind of a complex state where we are somewhere better in terms of our education, careers, and our earning powers. But do we want to be the archetypal men who had everything in his power? Because that was also a very isolated state to be in. I don't think it was a great situation to be in.
And you're still looking to other people to tell you your existence is okay. You know, it's just you're looking to a boss or, you know, to a client instead of looking to your spouse, but it's still unpleasant. And I think one thing I'm excited about with the timing of when the play is debuting is I think that after COVID, a lot of people are in this space of questioning, you know, on the one hand, questioning the way that so many women have like left the workforce the second that schools closed. Oh, of course it's women's job to step in and do all the unpaid labor. And of course it's women's job to pick up the slack. You know, to some degree, it's become clear how far we haven't come in terms of who keeps a household together. But I also think that a lot of people are getting to a point of sort of like, is my job everything? Like, like, if I can slap a label on myself and say like well-paid professional, is that better than, you know, slapping a label on myself and saying, you know, tidy housewife? So I think that I'm really excited about when the play is coming out, because I think sort of society is ready to have a conversation about, hey, our traditional male gendered ideal of a life is not great either. And our traditional female gendered ideal of a life is not great. And can we start to imagine something else together?
The way you used language is so brilliantly deliberate. Did you approach it as if it's written by someone other than you, who's trying to write in a kind of Milleresque style? Was it like seriously deliberate, or did it just flow?
It was very deliberate, to the point that I have like a YouTube playlist of like a lot of mid-century plays. Like I have a bunch of like Miller and like radio plays, but like Williams and you know, Odette's and like all and some sort of 50s movies too. The emotional openness of the language, that the sort of the metaphorical richness of the language. You know, you have these very ordinary characters who let loose with these like incredibly sophisticated metaphors, and these extended stories and images, and but also the emotional directness of the language, and the poetry of it. I think I found really enticing and really exciting to write in that style, because I definitely kind of came up and went to grad school in like an intense naturalism phase of American drama, at least. You know, I think that for like 10 years, what American drama was doing was like, if you can exactly replicate how normal people talk in a normal conversation, that's fascinating. And it was very liberating to just be like writing like Miller, and you're like, that's not how people talk. Like, we're dream talking now. We're talking like, you know, the big things and the big emotions, and kind of decide to like, I think in playwriting, it's always really exciting when you decide to like play with the big guns and like just there's bigger emotions in there. Let them all out was it was very exciting, but I definitely had to like steep myself in it. I mean, I grew up on like Turner Classic Movies. I naturally speak as if I'm from the past, but I still had to kind of very specifically there's that mid-century tone that I really wanted to capture, and I worked at it. So I'm glad it comes across.
There was one line that I was just rooting for my notebook, and I found it's so perfect. It was, marriage feels like being furniture. You don't get seen anymore. You just get sat on. And I thought that is absolutely what Arthur Miller would have written if he was a woman.
Yeah.
Maybe I hope that's a compliment, but I thought it was such a perfect ventriloquization of his voice. I love that line.
Thank you.
Just half an hour before the interview began, I messaged my brother those lines because I was reading the play again, and I found it so ironically funny, but there's just too much depth to what you said.
I think that might be one of the lines where people turn and glare at their dates.
Yeah, since we're talking about language, and I don't want to divulge a lot of details, but I really need to ask you about the radio and the many advertisements that were there. So could you tell us something more about that part?
Yeah, so it's mostly, as you two know, it's mostly a 2-character play with the wife and the mistress, but then there's this radio, and the radio is the voice of the outside world in the play, and frequently the voice of men in the play. It's the only time you hear like men speaking. And it's got, some snippets of audio dramas, radio dramas. We didn't call them audio dramas then, but like radio dramas and, variety hours, but also a ton of advertising. And to me, it's a way to talk partly about, these roles. We don't just come up with them out of our heads like, oh, you should be a sexy mistress. Like you should be a perfect wife. Like we get told to do them. We get very systematically told to do them by an enormous range of messaging that's sort of omnipresent in our lives that you can't escape from. I'm going to sound like this like fervent Marxist, which I'm not, but like it's a tool of capitalism. Like you make people feel insecure about their ability to fulfill their gender roles, and they go out and spend money to try to better fulfill their gender roles. Like you make me feel like a crappy mom who didn't keep her kids from getting colds, and so I'll go out and I'll buy Lysol wipes and I'll keep them in my diaper bag because that's what good moms do. Attractive women don't have thigh fat, and I'll spend money on someone who tells me that a Peloton will get rid of my thigh fat, like whatever. And, I think that it's sort of the degree to which these roles get constructed and enforced very systematically. And there's this push-pull dynamic between the women and the radio where there's times when they can start to try to articulate and imagine a version of themselves where they're not just defined by I'm the sexiest person in this room, or, I'm the best mom in this room, and they can define themselves a little more broadly. And the radio often pulls them back and reminds them that their worth comes from fulfilling these roles. And I thought it was really important. First of all, like just the sound of a radio advertisement instantly puts us in 1950 in this really like insta way where the fact that we're in a different period and the standards are different and the expectations are different clicks so quickly. And it starts out kind of funny and hopefully becomes sort of more alarming as you kind of realize what it's doing. But I hope that that's also another area where people start to ask themselves what's still true. Because we're still bombarded, my Instagram ads are very different, but they're still telling me that like, I'm a more fulfilled woman if I buy a particular frying pan, and, that I'm a lesser woman if I don't own that frying pan. And so I think that it's a way to talk sort of more broadly about these structures, the way that Miller does, that it's not an individual person's problem. It's a larger societal problem that individual people can't necessarily solve for themselves.
Yeah, it had me in thought of, have you ever seen the John Carpenter film, They Live?
No, wait, yes, I have. I saw it a long time ago, and I'm remembering the alien stuff much more than the ad stuff. But now I'm remembering the ad stuff too. Yes,
It's he wears the sunglasses and then he
And you
sees
can
that
see all
all
the
advertisement.
messages.
Yeah, advertisement is just about mind control. It just reminded me of that.
When if you listen to 50s ads, the messaging is so much more direct, and you can see more clearly. Like, and if you watch today's ads, you're like, that's innocuous. They're trying to get me to download a meditation app. Like, and it's like only when you like look at the 1950s ads that you realize how directly they're just playing on insecurity and peer pressure, which we still do.
I just want to ask you, there's this curious question. I guess this also kind of linked with your work as a history teacher. You said before that writing for you starts where the work of the historian stops. So how do you place your play in the context of this statement, especially since it springs from the work of a bygone era and very much tries to recreate that mythical period of American post-war boom?
Yeah, well, it's very related to me to that fact of that I'm, what I mentioned, I'm trying to have these conversations with my grandmothers that I never got them to actually have, As a historian, one of the hardest things to process, and my last play, The Niceties, was very much about this also, was we lost a lot of voices along the way. We don't have a complete picture of history, even the most scrupulous historian. And the voices we lose, and I think Miller was very much fighting to counteract this in 1949 with this. The voices we lose are the voices of working class people, the voices of women, the voices of people of color, the voices of quote unquote ordinary people are the voices that we lose. And they're the voices that are getting drowned out today also. And I think that, we have, like, if you want to understand the existence of a 1950s housewife, like what the internet will tell you to do is go read The Feminine Mystique. Great book. Feminine Mystique was not written by a woman who was continuing to live as a 1950s housewife. It's written with an agenda by a woman who had made very different choices. And so getting into, I think that there's, and that generation is also called frequently the silent generation. There are a lot of people who never told their story. And that's where fiction can step in and try to say, I'm going to do my best to take over for where my grandmothers stopped talking, the parts of their lives that they didn't talk about. I'm going to try to evoke, and I'm going to try to imagine what they might have said. And the parts that Miller left out, I'm going to try to fill in. And I think that that's where kind of our imaginations and our creativity can try to bring more of the historical record to life than a strictly scrupulous approach of statistics and primary sources can do.
I love the line, everyone knows how people get mean. I want to know how people get nice. Why do you think we are so fascinated by how people get mean? And how do you think people get nice?
Oh, I struggle so much with this. This is, it's really hard. And I think something that, I haven't exactly touched on, but we've talked about Miller in some ways being this very classic dramatist, in some ways not. A big question for me in the play was how much conflict the play had to have. And like Carol Churchill has talked about this, Sarah Rule has talked about, a lot of female playwrights have talked about, that we still think that a well-told story is a high conflict story where someone goes out and fights for something and wins it or doesn't win it. And that's what a good story is. And that's often a story about cruelty and like how far people will go. You right. And you like look up, like, I think you see it most easily in television, like great television shows. And it's like Breaking Bad, The Sopranos, like Game of Thrones, and it's like, that's stories about people being horrible. That's stories about people being violent, ruthless sociopaths, and yet the idea of like watching a story about someone trying to be their best self and trying to be a kind person and trying to, continue to have love and patience and fortitude in a world that's grinding them down, which is, I think, the Linda Lohman story, is that she never loses it. She never yells, and like all her sons lose it, and Willie loses it, and Linda never does, and always has more love and more kindness available. doesn't feel like an exciting story to us. And I think that's also very related to that lack of art about motherhood, because there's something so undramatic about motherhood. I show up every morning and I do the same thing I did the morning before. And it's very boring. And it's domestic, it's home-based, it's consistent. That's what kids need. It's loving and positive and repetitive. And that feels like the opposite of drama. And we don't like, when we watch art about mothers, it's always like dramatic art about evil mothers and, Tennessee Williams mothers, and like never about, and yet our society relies on these people who do put away their rage and put away their selfishness and find the ability to carry on. And so I think very much trying to see, can we make that exciting? Can we make that a person that we find compelling? Can we open up and hear from that person that it doesn't just come easily to them? It's not instant. It's not that they just don't have the rage and they don't have the, frustration. It's a choice. And it's a really like wonderful, difficult choice that a lot of people make, that I think maybe even the majority of people make. And so I do think that we enjoy this, Breaking Bad style art because we can live vicariously through it. Like everyone wants to imagine that they get to bully and shoot the most annoying person they know. But that isn't how we live mostly. Thank God most of us don't live that way. And instead of this escapist fare of what if you did get to be fucking bitch, like having this escape, having like an upholding in art of like, what if you decide to do the right thing? What if we could value that? That's what I'm trying to examine, but it's really hard because you feel like you're absolutely swimming against the tide and you're absolutely fighting our human instincts to enjoy the vicarious thrill of cruelty and violence. It's really sad to like come up against that part of human nature and be like, kindness is boring to people.
Well, I find that line really stopped me in my tracks. I'm like, for example, I'm a huge fan of Taxi Driver. I think it's just a brilliant piece of art, but it's exactly about somebody getting mean.
Yeah.
And when I read that, I thought, oh yeah, I never even thought about that. How do people get nice? What is that process?
And I've been in the last couple of years kind of returning to some art that I grew up with, like Anne of Green Gables and Little Women. I'm from the 19th century, basically. And like, I do think part of what I love about them is that they're actually taking, Little Women especially takes really seriously the project of like, become a nicer person, even when it's not rewarded. And I think we do tell those stories more often to women than to men, but we tell them to men too. And I think upholding those stories and not looking at them as like lesser and for children and moralistic, but looking at them as like really wonderful. The Bible's the one time when we like really respect a story about trying to be a better person, specifically the New Testament, not the Old Testament so much.
So I called my mom Marmy at one point of time.
Oh my God, I love that. I might have to tell my mom that because my mom like used Little Women as her parenting manual. Like
it is a parenting manual, but I think it's just sometimes because I think it's only when I grew up and I realized that but how is it possible to be so nice all the time? Like, how can she be the perfect mother all the time? And I have a perfect mother. So it's not like I don't have an example to see. But the point is that I also know at the same time, because my mom is not a person who's not telling her story at the same time. Sometimes she does get frustrated. Because motherhood is, I think, I am not a mother yet, but I think it's a lot of hard work. And as you said, consistent doing of the same stuff. So
and I think we all have a choice to be good. I think we all have a choice to be Linda instead of being Willie. And we have a choice to be patient and kind and supportive instead of being selfish and cruel and lashing out. And I think a lot of what society really depends on is us making the good choice every day. And I want to uphold that as valuable instead of like a weakness or something.
Okay, given that we've straight on to topics of motherhood and the Bible, about which I am radically unqualified to speak, I want to move it on. Can you tell us a bit more about the rest of the creative team that are involved in this production?
Oh, we have a fantastic team. I'm so lucky to just have amazing people working on it. I mean, first of all, I have to give a huge shout out to, I think the thing that like got me through, I did a huge rewrite of this play during the pandemic, and there's no way I would have done it without, I had a rewrite commission from Writers Theater in Chicago and Milwaukee Rep. I had a co-commission from the two theaters. And having that sort of support and that, and they'd previously, it's been a long journey for the play. There's been several workshops, and having that kind of sustained interest and support from institutions is like, I think it makes the difference between whether you can carry on and do the difficult rewrite and reach a greater level of profundity in your writing. So I'm just so grateful to both those institutions. And to sort of many collaborators along the way there. For this individual production, we've got a phenomenal cast and director. Our director is Jo Bonney, and she's been just amazing at sort of pushing me to always look for the deepest possible version of the play and the most resonant possible and the most contemporary version possible, that sort of speaks to all these different time periods of where women are at and where men are at, and what we can be, taking away from the play to look at life today. And we have a phenomenal cast, Kate Fry, Amanda Drinkle, and Ron Barcorder. And I think audiences in Chicago are in for just like a real treat. And we had this amazing luxury of workshopping the play with that cast, which you rarely get to do, at least in the States. I don't know as much about sort of international production, but to kind of be in a longer process with them and having them help shape the rewrites and with their questions and their personality, and has been such a huge luxury, and they're awesome. So I think the production will be really good, and I'm excited.
We certainly know that you are a person from the 19th century and you love all of the classics, and which is why perhaps you chose to do this. But are you thinking of doing the same with the other classics?
Yes and no. I think that for me, whenever I write a play in a particular way, I exhaust that entire way of writing for myself, and I have to try a new way of writing. Like part of the reason why the radios in the play is that my last play was a two-hander. And when it looked like this play was going to be a two-hander, I was like, I need a new voice in there. I need to, like, I can't do what I just did, just for myself, just to continue to surprise myself with the writing process. So I think that kind of like literally taking a known work and playing with the characters from it, it's going to be a while before I feel ready to do that again. But because, no one can change who they are. I cannot change who I am any more than Arthur Miller could change who he was. My new play that is sort of earlier in its process is kind of a deconstruction of the Jesus story. It begins a few months after Jesus has died, and his disciples are trying to remember what he told them and figure out what he'd want them to do, and like write down what he taught and figure out their next steps. And then this guy, Saul, St. Paul, shows up and doesn't necessarily agree with the quote unquote Virgin Mary about her son's legacy. So in some ways I'm totally doing it again, because I'm just taking a well-known story and messing with it.
That sounds very interesting.
That sounds great. I don't know if you have a title, but would you call it Death of a Savior?
Ooh, I like it. It's currently called Galilee 34.
Galilee 34. Oh, excellent. Yeah. That sounds fantastic.
While you were speaking, Kiran and I had our, antennas on about Resurrection Blues by Miller, because
So we have to mention this every episode. So
Miller and I are just two Jews who are obsessed with Jesus. There's a lot of us out there. There's a lot of us out there, but that's one more thing Miller and I have in common.
Well, yeah. Have you read his oh God, I can't even remember his Old Testament play?
Which one is it?
The Creation of the World and Other Business.
No, I've bought a copy at the Drama Bookshop in New York, and I haven't read it yet. I need to read it. Yeah, that's like in my when I transitioned from opening my Miller play to rewriting my Jesus play. That'll be my bridge.
it's
Red Resurrection Blues. So, yeah.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, we're big fans, and we're trying to get.
Awesome. I read it like in high school, and I liked it better than Death of a Salesman.
Wow. Was that set on the curriculum, or was that independent reading?
No, I like ran into it at a used bookshop and was like, interesting. I like this premise. Like, cool.
I don't know why it's never on the curriculum anywhere. Because
I can think of a few reasons.
And it's just Crucible and Salesman everywhere across the world.
Yeah, and it's never produced either. I mean, I've never had an opportunity to see it live that I know of. I don't think I've ever had an opportunity to see it live. People do like All My Sons. I'm like, are we really going to do All My Sons again and not Resurrection Blues? Like, really? Like, yeah. Come on, people out there listening. Shift the Miller canon.
we're very much doing our best, and it's very exciting to talk to somebody else who knows Resurrection Blues. This is a tweet of yours recently. You said directors, production managers, everybody, include playwrights in your design meetings. Another similarity between yourself and Miller. He was often actively involved in productions of his plays. Could you talk about your personal experiences with production and what writers can bring to productions that they're currently not being facilitated to do?
Yeah, and I should say, I don't know if it's not being, facilitated is a good word for it, because it's not, I've never felt like excluded or not allowed from the process. But I think that there's maybe an assumption that the playwright doesn't want to be involved or isn't helpful at the early stage in the design process. And often I think playwrights are brought on like once sketches exist and once things are being built and it's kind of like set in stone. And I think it's a missed opportunity, because I think that especially with a new play that you're actively rewriting, sometimes you can sort of speak off the cuff about what's driving you and what you're still exploring and what was fueling your work in ways that might really spark something from the designer. And then the designer's ideas spark something in you, and it can become a wonderful feedback cycle in the same way that working with the right actor and the right director is. So I was actually talking a lot with this play about the fact that I was really interested in how Miller was much more of like an expressionistic writer than a naturalistic, right? And that I think when you picture mid-century drama, maybe because of Williams, you picture like a natural set. And of course, Miller and all the productions he was involved in, it was much more abstracted than that. He was like halfway to Thornton Wilder a lot of the time. And so I was really interested in the degree to which he's not at all doing naturalism. And that's not understood, because I think a lot of these mid-century guys sort of, we squish them together in our minds. And having a chance to talk about that, I think really sparked something we have this gorgeous set and for the Chicago production, and kind of that freedom to explore in those directions, I think was positive. And then, for sound design, obviously the radio is like a huge part of the play. And I'm still figuring out what the radio should say and working with the sound designer on what are cool sounds from the 50s, what am I missing? What have I not found yet? So I think that oftentimes before a play is published, you haven't yet learned to articulate the right amount of what inspired and drove you. And ideally, when you publish a play, you're able to like really get down on paper, here's what was driving me, go forth with that knowledge and make the play. But before a play is locked and published, you haven't yet figured out which sentences really open things up for people. And by being in the room with the designers, you can figure out like, oh, this is the sentence that like really tells you what the radio is doing. And I didn't put that sentence in the script. That sentence has been living in my head for a year, So I think it's just really syncretic and positive, and should be standard practice to have designers talking to playwrights on unpublished plays. As long as the designers are open to it, I don't want to be imposing my presence on people, like well before any sketches, just like, hey, what was on your mind when you wrote this? Like, never to be prescriptive, just to be additive.
But do you stay completely open to like suggestions? Like say it comes from an actor.
I try really hard to. I have no vision in my head of especially with design of like what the set will look like or what the lighting will be. Like, I don't try to put, I mean, you guys have read the script. I don't try to put on paper, here's how it should look. I try to stay very bare bones. Like, well, we need this, this, and this. And other than those three things, you make it. And I think that maybe the reason why playwrights aren't invited is because maybe some playwrights are like very stuck in, you know, the version in their head and aren't open to the possibility that someone else brings something. What I love about working in theater is that there are multiple right options. Like, it's so amazing to work in an art form where there isn't one right production of Hamlet. You know, there's the one where they did it this way and that added this, and the one where they did it this way and that added this. And there isn't one right production of Death of a Salesman, and there isn't, you know, I don't think there's one right production of Wife of a Salesman. And I love the leaving space for designers to bring their awesome vision, and, you know, then it might be totally different in the next production. So I do think that if a playwright becomes closed off or thinks that it's their job to control the process, then that would make it unpleasant to invite playwrights into the process. So I think, like, with power comes responsibility. Like, I hope to be invited in to inspire and to, you know, open up possibilities rather than to close down possibilities.
The play starts in Chicago on 3rd of March. Do you have plans for touring yet, or for bringing the play overseas to India?
Oh my gosh, I hope it will. I hope we'll get to go to a lot of places. It would mean a lot to me. I think it's a very universal story, and it would mean a lot to me for it to go to more places. Nothing's set in stone yet. I would urge people to check my website, which is www.eleanorburgess.com, and or like follow me on Twitter, and I talk about, you know, anything upcoming as it comes up, because there's lots of possibilities, but nothing set besides Chicago, March 3rd. It's going to be amazing.
Absolutely. Can I ask, how long is the run?
It's a month. I think it runs through like April 5th or 6th.
Okay, excellent. I guess just to kind of last question to wrap up, and it's kind of frustrating that this question still has to be asked, but are there any plans for perhaps an online screening for people who can't get to the theater?
So there's no concrete plans yet, but I think that that's a possibility. And, you know, I love trying to make work as accessible as possible. So I would definitely urge people to check out the Writers Theater website. If you Google Wife of a Salesman or Writers Theater Chicago, you can get to the website and sort of keep an eye on it, because it's definitely something we're exploring as, you know, variants happen, but also as you kind of look at, it's a international play. It's a, you know, play with there's people who can't leave home as easily, and it's exciting to have that toolbox added, even if I do stand live theater.
With this, we have come to the close of our discussion with you, Eleanor, and I don't know, I'm just too impressed by how bold your take is on Miller's Women, and I think Kieran has the same feelings about it. He better agree though.
No, that was really, really interesting, and I want to thank you for coming on, but thank you for sharing so much of your personal life with us, and that's not necessarily an easy thing to do. So yeah, we really do appreciate that.
Thanks so much for the opportunity to talk about the play and about all of these musings that, you know, keep me up at night all by myself. Yeah, no, it's really lovely to have a chance to talk about it and get into it with other people who, you know, share the same love-hate, tense, complicated relationship with this artistic legacy and with these contemporary questions.
I think the best takeaway for me from this would be your thoughts on kindness being cool, because, you know, it's just so often that we talk about so many other things, but we never emphasize enough on this. And, you know, to just initiate that conversation and the importance of dialogue about it.
Yeah, God, I hope so. Actually, my grandfather died in the past year, I guess a year ago. He was 96. And at some point before he died, he sort of said, like, I've really been thinking about it, and I think the meaning of life is kindness. And that was always how he'd lived, and it was this was not the salesman. Yeah, the grandfather.
That's really sweet. That's perfect. I was trying to call my own grandmother before we spoke, because I'm going to see my grandfather for the first time in a couple of years next month. So, and I'm sure he'd feel the exact same way. It's a really beautiful sentiment. Well, Eleanor Burgess, thank you so much. We look forward to reading more of your work, hopefully seeing some of your work if it ever gets to Ireland and India, and I really hope it does. And good luck with everything.
Thank you so much. It's been such a fun conversation, and I would love to bring my work to Ireland or India and meet in person. That would be amazing.
But until then, at least have an online screening, because we're really looking forward to at least watch it in the meantime, to get a glimpse of it, get some idea about how the actors perform.
We'll do our best.
Thanks a lot, Eleanor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that was our interview with Eleanor Burgess. Ambika, what did you think?
I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation, Kiran. I love how Miller continues to inspire young contemporary playwrights and audiences in such different ways. And I appreciate Eleanor's portrayal of women in the play and the way she includes personal experiences in her writing.
Yes, definitely. I think there's a lot of honesty in it, and I really like that. And from my point of view, it was one I really loved listening back to while editing it. And I was struck by how often we flipped from laughing and having fun to discussing pretty serious, difficult issues.
Oh, sure. I'm just sad that neither of us will get to see the play anytime soon. However, if they have an online screening of the play, it will be very nice for the both of us.
Yes, absolutely. I'd really love to see how it translates from the page to not quite the stage, but the screen at least. Anyway, that is all we have for today. You can listen to the podcast on Buzzsprout or Spotify, or Google us to find the player that suits you best. Follow the Arthur Miller Society on Facebook, Twitter, and now YouTube, where you can also listen to the podcast. Wife of a Salesman runs at the Writers Theatre, Chicago, from 3rd of March to the 3rd of April. Get tickets at writerstheatre.org or see the episode description for more information.
A very happy New Year again to all of our listeners. Thanks for tuning in. Take care. Goodbye for now.
Thank you very much.